Welcome to Bed of Legends, a place where history drifts gently into dreams. Tonight, let us travel across time and continents to explore the quiet evolution of something we all live by, but rarely think about: time itself. Dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let your thoughts slow with each word. This is a story not to awaken the mind, but to cradle it. Let us begin. Before the world had clocks, before trains raced across the land or schedules ruled our waking hours, time was something softer. It moved with the sun, danced with the moon, and drifted through the seasons. People lived by light and shadow, heat and chill, the rising and setting of a day. In a village nestled among the rolling hills or a town stretched alongside a river, time was felt in the birdsong, in the shift of color across the sky, in the rustle of leaves turning gold in autumn's quiet sigh. There was a time when time itself was not measured in minutes but marked in moments. A shepherd would rise with the morning mist, letting the dew guide his pace. A baker knew when to knead by the warmth of the air seeping into the stone walls. Fishermen looked to the stars, and farmers watched the slow curve of the sun's journey to know when to plant, when to harvest, and when to rest. In ancient Egypt, the people crafted tall stone shadows, obelisks that stretched into the sky. As sunlight moved across them, they became the first rough clocks. The Babylonians divided the day into parts, guided by the movement of celestial bodies. And yet, none of these efforts tried to make time uniform. In one valley, noon might be when the sun was highest above the fig tree. In another, it was when shadows slipped behind a distant hill. There was something deeply local about time. Each village, each city, each land had its rhythm, a lullaby only the locals knew. The Romans, ingenious as they were, devised sundials to tell time in daylight, their faces carved in marble and bronze, turning sunlight into something visible. But when clouds gathered or night fell, the clocks fell silent. Time resumed its whisper, guiding people not with numbers but with nudges. Medieval monasteries began to chant the hours. 7 times a day, the devout would stop what they were doing and pray. Matins in the dark before dawn. Lauds as the sky blushed with light. Prime after sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at midday, none in the afternoon, and vespers as evening deepened. These rhythms weren't just spiritual, they became practical. In towns surrounding monasteries, bells became the pulse of life, gently calling bakers to start, merchants to open, and children to return home before the shadows grew long. As the centuries wore on, mechanical ingenuity began to shape time. In the 14th century, the first mechanical clocks began appearing in Europe, their gears turning with a slow, measured tick. Tower clocks with heavy iron weights struck the hours aloud, and people began to orient themselves not just by sunlight but by sound. Still, each clock was set to local solar time, what the sun said noon was, and that meant every town remained its own little world of time. But clocks had their quirks. They slowed in the cold, raced in the heat, and ticked off hours that were not always the same length. Yet even with their flaws, they brought a kind of order. Artisans shaped time into something shareable, if not yet standardized. City squares had clocks that told through fog and mist, and villagers listened for their comfort as much as their accuracy. In many parts of the world, timekeeping took on different shapes. In China, water clocks had flowed for centuries, bowls filling and tipping in rhythmic motion. In the Islamic world, scholars advanced the science of the astrolabe, turning the sky into a vast, delicate timepiece. In Mesoamerica, the Maya constructed calendar systems so complex and precise they tracked the cycles of Venus and the tilt of the Earth. And still, these methods of time were rooted in the natural, the heavens, the moon, the flow of water. It was not about seconds. It was about cycles. Time was circular, like the seasons. It returned. It breathed. It waited. A traveler crossing lands in the 1600s or 1700s might carry a pocket watch, its tiny ticking heart beating in brass and glass. But when he stepped into a new town, he would reset it to the local church bell. Noon here was not noon there. A difference of minutes or even hours could pass unnoticed or unbothered. Daily life unfolded without countdowns. Children played until the light faded. Markets opened with the morning bustle and closed as lanterns were lit. Lovers met under certain stars, not at a designated hour. People slept when tired, woke with birds, ate when hungry, rested when the sky told them to. The world hummed at a slower pace. The Industrial Revolution was not yet underway. The railroads had not yet carved time into sharp zones. There were no time zones, no world clocks. There were only people, looking up. And in that looking, at the sky, the sun, the moon, there was peace. No alarms rang. No schedules stacked. No digital ticks. Just time, alive in the whisper of leaves, in the warmth of day, in the slow fall of night. Even the idea of measuring seconds was foreign. A second was a sliver too thin to be practical. A minute, perhaps, but only for the astronomer or the priest. Most lived in larger pockets of time: a morning, noon, dusk, night. These were enough. These were plenty. In the countryside, the rooster and the church bell ruled. In cities, shopkeepers watched the light on their stoops and guessed the hour by habit. In palaces, kings and queens sat for paintings that might take days, and no one minded how long. Time was elastic. It stretched and yawned and flowed like a lazy river. But soon, that river would be channeled. The steady drumbeat of change was coming. Inventions were waking. Gears were grinding. Steel was forming. And with it, time would slowly begin to harden, into hours, into zones, into something shared across oceans. But before all that, there was still this moment. In the early 19th century, a new sense of urgency began to emerge across industrial societies. With the acceleration of steam-powered transportation and increasingly intricate communication networks, the age-old reliance on solar time was showing its cracks. Communities that once flourished under their own interpretations of noon were now being pulled into a shared rhythm dictated by trains, telegraphs, and factories. It was a shift not only in technology but in how time itself was understood, measured, and experienced. As railways expanded their iron veins across continents, a peculiar challenge surfaced. Trains traveling from one town to another would often cross regions that kept different local times, based on the sun's position. What had once been a charming local distinction quickly became a dangerous logistical dilemma. Train timetables, crucial for both passengers and freight, were plagued by confusion. A train might be scheduled to leave a city at 11 a.m. and arrive in another at 10:55 a.m., simply because the towns kept slightly different solar times. Conductors had to consult complicated charts, and railway dispatchers operated under a patchwork of local standards. The problem wasn't unique to one country. Across Europe and North America, the conversation began to shift toward the possibility of a unified approach. In Britain, the railroads were the first to make bold moves. The Great Western Railway, under the guidance of Sir Sandford Fleming, adopted what came to be known as railway time, a standardized clock based on Greenwich Mean Time, GMT. By the 1840s, this change had taken hold across most British rail lines. It was not without resistance. Townsfolk clung to their local clocks, some refusing to reset the church bell even as train stations synchronized with Greenwich. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States was wrestling with an even greater complication. With its vast geography and thousands of small towns, there were reportedly over 300 local time standards in use by the 1870s. This patchwork of times not only complicated train travel but posed risks to safety. Train collisions, due in part to inconsistent timekeeping, led to calls for reform. The railroads again took the lead. In 1883, American and Canadian railway companies implemented a bold plan. They divided the continent into 5 time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific, and Intercolonial, each spanning 15 degrees of longitude. On November 18th of that year, known as the Day of Two Noons, towns and cities across North America adjusted their clocks to align with this new system. The transition was not legislated by any government but driven entirely by industrial necessity. And yet, it stuck. Within a year, most of the population had adopted the new time zones, and public clocks reflected the shared standard. Across the globe, a similar conversation was unfolding. As nations modernized, they faced the same tension between local tradition and industrial efficiency. Telegraph operators, shipping companies, and eventually broadcasters all had a stake in synchronized time. The world was inching toward an international consensus. Sir Sandford Fleming, the Canadian engineer who had advocated for railway time, proposed a radical idea: divide the world into 24 time zones, each 1 hour apart, starting at the prime meridian. His vision gained traction and led to the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C., in 1884. Delegates from 26 nations gathered not only to select the prime meridian, Greenwich, England, but also to discuss the adoption of a standardized global system. Though not all countries immediately adopted the recommendations, the idea of global time zones had begun to crystallize. A central meridian, a fixed system of offsets, and international coordination were slowly replacing the chaotic patchwork of local solar times. It was a momentous, if subtle, transformation in the fabric of daily life. The very act of keeping time had become both a personal and political decision. Some nations delayed their adoption of standard time, seeing it as a symbol of foreign influence. Others modified the system to suit national needs. France, for example, initially resisted aligning with Greenwich and retained Paris Mean Time for several years. India adopted a half-hour offset, a legacy that continues to this day. The Soviet Union implemented its own extensive and sometimes baffling structure of time zones, dictated by central planning and national pride. As standard time gained traction, resistance persisted. Farmers, in particular, objected. They had long relied on natural indicators, the position of the sun, the behavior of animals, the rhythms of the land, to organize their days. The idea that the sun could be high in the sky at 1 p.m. because the government said so seemed absurd. Rural communities clung to local time for decades, even as cities synchronized with global clocks. By the early 20th century, the standard time zone system was largely in place, but refinement continued. Daylight saving time, first introduced during World War I as a means of conserving fuel, added another layer of complexity. Clocks were pushed forward or backward seasonally, disrupting routines but promising energy savings and longer evenings. Some nations embraced the change, others resisted or abandoned it altogether. The debate over its merits continues even now. Meanwhile, the adoption of standard time enabled remarkable advances. Weather forecasting became more accurate, relying on synchronized data from multiple locations. The stock market could open and close at uniform times. News traveled across the world not just swiftly, but with predictable timestamps. Air travel, in particular, became feasible only because of a shared understanding of time. Without standardized zones, pilots and passengers alike would be lost in temporal chaos. Perhaps most profoundly, time zones reshaped how people thought about the world. No longer bound by the rising and setting of the sun, human activity could be planned across continents. A business call between London and Tokyo became not only possible but routine. People began to see time as a grid, a structured map imposed upon the globe, connecting lives across oceans and borders. Yet for all its utility, the rise of time zones also came with trade-offs. Time, once a deeply local and organic experience, became an abstract and external force. The ringing of bells gave way to ticking clocks. Noon no longer meant the sun was overhead, it meant what the schedule dictated. This standardization, while essential for modernity, invited a certain detachment from nature's rhythms. Still, the world marched on. Countries negotiated their zones, adjusted boundaries, and refined policies. Time became both a scientific construct and a cultural symbol. The simple question, "What time is it?" could now be answered with confidence almost anywhere on Earth, so long as one knew their place on the grid. In the quiet evening hours, as street lamps flickered on in coordinated harmony from city to city, the legacy of this temporal transformation was etched into the stillness. It was a silent agreement between strangers, a testament to human coordination and adaptation. Time. As the 19th century drew toward its midpoint, the gap between the physical expansion of transportation and communication technologies and the localized, outdated system of timekeeping grew increasingly apparent. With railroads stretching further across continents and telegraph wires weaving invisible threads between cities, the necessity for a unified concept of time, one that transcended the peculiarities of local solar noon, became more than just a theoretical concern. It was a daily, operational dilemma. In the United States, where the railway network expanded rapidly and with little central planning, the situation was especially chaotic. Each town set its clocks according to the sun's position, resulting in a bewildering array of time standards. A traveler journeying from Boston to Chicago might cross through dozens of time zones in a single day, depending on the interpretation used by each local municipality. For railway companies, which relied on strict timetables to manage the safety and flow of trains, this system was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. One of the most vocal advocates for reform was William Frederick Allen, an editor of the Official Railway Guide and the secretary of the General Time Convention, a gathering of American railway managers. Allen understood that the railroads could not continue operating under such a fragmented system. A single, standard timekeeping system was essential. But achieving it would require overcoming not only technical challenges but cultural resistance and local pride. After all, convincing towns to abandon their own true time, based on their unique longitude and solar experience, was no small matter. The proposal was to divide the continent into a handful of longitudinal time zones, each 15 degrees of longitude apart, corresponding to 1 hour of time. Each zone would be centered on a specific meridian, and the local time within that zone would be derived from the solar noon at that meridian. It was a logical plan, drawing upon the Earth's own rotation and the division of its 360 degrees into 24 equal parts. In 1883, the railroads took a bold step. On November 18th of that year, a date that would come to be known as the Day of Two Noons, American and Canadian railroads adopted a system of standard time. At precisely noon on that day, each railroad station adjusted its clocks to align with one of the 5 newly established time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific, and Intercolonial. The transition was remarkably smooth, despite the fact that no government mandate enforced it. The railroads, by virtue of their centrality to daily life and commerce, effectively redefined time itself. The adoption of standard time by the railroads was not without controversy. Some cities and towns clung to their local time, unwilling to bow to the influence of distant railway corporations. In many places, 2 clocks would be displayed, one showing railroad time and the other local time. Churches, schools, and municipal buildings were slow to adopt the change. But over time, the logic of standardization proved irresistible. Commerce, communication, and coordination all benefited from a shared temporal framework. Meanwhile, in Europe, similar pressures were mounting. The Industrial Revolution had transformed daily life, and the rise of international telegraphy made the inconsistencies of local time increasingly burdensome. In Britain, the Royal Observatory at Greenwich had long served as the reference point for navigational purposes. Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, was already widely recognized among mariners. The concept of extending this time reference to terrestrial life gained traction in the latter half of the century. Greenwich centrality was not universally embraced. France, for instance, promoted the Paris meridian as a rival standard. Other countries, with their own historical observatories and proud scientific traditions, were reluctant to adopt a foreign standard. The idea of global time zones, each anchored to a longitudinal reference, was sound. But agreeing on where those references should fall required diplomacy, consensus, and the willingness of nations to subordinate local identity to global utility. In 1884, the matter came to a head at the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. Delegates from 25 nations gathered to resolve the issue of a prime meridian and to discuss the broader question of time standardization. After considerable debate, the conference adopted the Greenwich meridian as the prime meridian of the world. This decision laid the groundwork for the global system of time zones, each offset from Greenwich by a fixed number of hours. The adoption of the Greenwich meridian as the global reference was not without its detractors. France abstained from the vote and continued to use the Paris meridian for several decades in official documents. Yet the momentum of standardization was unstoppable. The needs of commerce, travel, and communication were too great to be hindered by national pride. Even with these international agreements, the implementation of time zones varied widely. Some countries embraced the system immediately, while others delayed. Some regions, due to political complexity or geographic considerations, adopted unusual offsets, 30 or 45 minutes instead of full hours. In many ways, the new system of time was both a simplification and a new complexity. The old, chaotic patchwork of local times was replaced by a structured grid, but one that still had to accommodate human geography and political boundaries. As time zones became more entrenched in daily life, they began to influence more than just train schedules. Schools, businesses, governments, all began to synchronize their activities to standardized clocks. The very rhythm of modern life began to beat in time with these artificial boundaries drawn across the globe. And while the sun continued its ancient, unchanging arc across the sky, human civilization now lived by the tick of a clock regulated not by the heavens, but by an agreement forged in steel rails and diplomatic chambers. Yet even as the system spread, it remained a work in progress. Adjustments were made, boundaries redrawn. Daylight saving time, first proposed as a way to make better use of daylight during the summer months, would later complicate the temporal landscape even further. But the core idea, that the world could share a system of coordinated time, had taken hold. The slow revolution of timekeeping reached a new stage in the mid-19th century. Around the world, the spread of railways had drawn new, invisible lines across landscapes that had previously been guided by the sun. Now, mechanical schedules replaced the rhythm of light and shadow. Every station had to be coordinated. Every minute had to count. In this changing world, time zones, still informal, became not only necessary but inevitable. Before this shift, each town kept its own solar time. Noon was when the sun reached its highest point. A traveler going from one town to another could experience several noons in a single day. In practice, these local times worked fine until the arrival of trains. Trains, unlike horses, could cover distances in hours instead of days, shrinking space and exposing the chaos of uncoordinated clocks. England was among the first countries to confront the issue. With the spread of the Great Western Railway, it became evident that local times caused confusion, even danger. One train might leave a town on one clock and be expected to arrive at another where the time was several minutes off. Timetables became unreliable. People missed trains. Worse, trains collided due to mismatches in schedule and assumption. In response, British railway companies adopted Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, for consistency. By the 1850s, most stations, and eventually whole towns followed suit, aligning themselves with this standard time even if the sun no longer matched the clock. The story was similar in the United States but more fragmented. The vastness of the country, with its varied landscapes and expanding rail network, made the timekeeping issue especially challenging. By the 1870s, the U.S. had over 300 local times in use. Each railway line published its own schedule based on its preferred time standard, and stations often displayed multiple clocks. Passengers and workers alike found it frustrating and perplexing. The American solution came not from the government but from the railroads themselves. In 1883, the General Time Convention, a gathering of railroad managers, agreed to implement a system of standardized time zones. On November 18, 1883, known as the Day of Two Noons, railroads across the US and Canada synchronized their clocks to new standardized zones. These zones roughly followed lines of longitude and divided the continent into four main time bands: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. At high noon in each zone, the clocks were set accordingly, and a new kind of order began. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some towns resisted, clinging to their traditional solar time. In church sermons, the new railroad time was denounced as unnatural, even heretical. Some communities posted both local and standard times, refusing to fully abandon the old ways. But gradually, practicality won. Commerce, communication, and coordination demanded conformity. Within a few decades, standardized time zones had replaced the patchwork of solar time across most of North America. Meanwhile, Europe was watching. The spread of telegraph lines and trains on the continent brought similar challenges. Countries began to debate the adoption of standard times. In France, Italy, Germany, and Russia, time unification moved forward at different paces, often accompanied by debates between scientists, politicians, and clergy. But the underlying motivation was the same: the need to coordinate an increasingly connected world. The growing consensus led to a significant gathering in 1884, the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. Representatives from 25 nations assembled to address the issue of global time. The conference aimed to resolve several key questions. Should the world adopt a common prime meridian? How should time zones be defined globally? What role should governments and science play in standardizing time? After spirited debates, the conference established the Greenwich Meridian as the prime meridian of the world. It passed through the Royal Observatory in London and was already widely used by British navigators. The decision marked a major shift. Though France and a few other nations abstained or expressed reservations, the Greenwich line was accepted as the baseline for calculating longitude and time zones. From it, the globe would be divided into 24 time zones, each covering 15 degrees of longitude. This proposal, while bold, was not implemented overnight. Many countries took years, even decades, to fully align with the new system. Still, the foundations were laid. For the first time in history, there was a shared vision of global time, a network of invisible bands stretching from pole to pole, slicing the planet into measured, mechanical hours. Back in everyday life, people began to adapt. Station masters synchronized clocks with telegraph signals. Newspapers printed new standardized schedules. Factories coordinated shifts according to zone time rather than solar time. Children learned the new system in school. Timekeeping was no longer a local affair. It had become national, even international, a quiet shift that changed the very structure of daily life. Yet, not all issues were resolved. Political borders rarely aligned neatly with longitudinal lines. As a result, many countries created customized time zones, bending them to fit geography and national pride. Some places observed half-hour offsets or unusual arrangements to stay in sync with capital cities or trading partners. This flexibility allowed for national identity but complicated the ideal of strict 15-degree divisions. In India, for instance, a single time zone stretched across a wide expanse, causing the sun to rise far earlier in the east than in the west. In Australia, multiple time zones were adopted, with some regions observing peculiar 30 or 45-minute offsets. In China, a vast landmass unified under a single zone, Beijing time, led to curious effects, especially in the far west where noon might fall mid-afternoon. Despite these complications, the world slowly adjusted. From farmers in the American Midwest to factory workers in Manchester to train conductors in Tokyo, people recalibrated their lives. Time had become something shared, something measured not by sun or stars but by agreement and transmission. The Earth still turned, but now it did so under a new system, a ticking rhythm that crossed borders and cultures. Thus, by the close of the 19th century, the essential map of time zones was largely in place. It would undergo modifications, expansions, as the 20th century unfolded. The establishment and fine-tuning of time zones continued to evolve alongside the progress of science, politics, and global communication. Though the foundational structure of time zones had been laid, the world was far from unified in practice. The practicalities of aligning regions, cities, and even rural towns with designated time standards often faced bureaucratic, cultural, and technical challenges. One significant development in the early 20th century was the adoption of time zones in newly industrializing nations. Countries in Asia, Latin America, and parts of Africa, previously unregulated or operating under colonial systems of timekeeping, began formalizing their time policies. As national governments sought to modernize infrastructure, regulate railways, and participate in international commerce, time zones became an indispensable tool. Each country faced the complex decision of whether to align with existing GMT-based zones or define new ones based on local political and geographic considerations. China, for example, experienced a unique timekeeping transformation. Though the country spans 5 geographical time zones, the Chinese government chose to adopt a single time zone, Beijing time, as a symbol of national unity. This decision, while simplifying official schedules, created incongruities in daily life for citizens in far western regions such as Xinjiang, where solar noon might occur as late as 3 p.m. by the official clock. These tensions between administrative efficiency and regional reality highlighted the underlying compromises in standardizing time across vast territories. In contrast, India opted for a single time zone that closely approximated its mean longitudinal center. Indian Standard Time (IST) was based on a meridian near Allahabad, splitting the difference between practical necessity and regional compromise. Yet in northeastern India, particularly in Assam and the surrounding states, there was pushback against IST. Locals preferred tea garden time, an unofficial schedule 1 hour ahead of IST, better suited to the earlier sunrise in that region. This local adaptation underscores how standardized time often coexists uneasily with cultural and agricultural practices that follow natural rhythms. The Soviet Union, a massive expanse of territory stretching across 11 time zones, represented one of the most ambitious timekeeping projects in history. Initially adopting a system aligned with GMT, the Soviet leadership later implemented decree time, moving clocks an hour ahead year-round. This was partly for industrial productivity and partly a symbolic gesture of progress. However, the top-down implementation and later rollback of certain policies exposed the limits of centralized control over such a fundamentally local and temporal experience. The interwar period also saw the refinement of daylight saving time, DST, a concept first introduced during World War I as a fuel-saving measure. While not universally embraced, DST gained traction in various Western countries. Germany, Britain, and the United States experimented with and adjusted their DST policies, often facing public confusion and resistance. The biannual clock changes, springing forward and falling back, added another layer of complexity to timekeeping, affecting everything from broadcast schedules to banking hours. Technological innovation, particularly in telecommunications and aviation, exerted pressure on global timekeeping systems. As international radio broadcasts and airmail routes emerged, the need for reliable cross-border time coordination grew. The International Telecommunication Union (ITU), a United Nations agency, played a role in encouraging the synchronization of time standards for radio transmissions, which required precise timing to avoid signal interference. Air travel, once limited and irregular, became increasingly common. The need for standardized time became critical as airlines began scheduling flights across multiple time zones. The advent of commercial aviation in the 1920s and 1930s necessitated further synchronization. Airlines published timetables that translated departure and arrival times into local time zones, forcing passengers and airline operators alike to grapple with the reality of time shifts over geographical distance. As timekeeping systems matured, international organizations began taking a more active role in codifying and promoting consistency in time zone use. The League of Nations, for instance, convened discussions on international time agreements, though without binding resolutions. It became evident that global consensus on time zone policies would remain elusive without a central enforcement mechanism. World War II marked another pivotal period for time zones. Wartime exigencies prompted many nations to revise their time policies to enhance productivity and coordination. The United Kingdom adopted British double summer time, moving clocks 2 hours ahead of GMT during certain months. Similarly, the United States extended DST nationwide as war time, to better align work hours with daylight. While these measures were temporary, they laid the groundwork for post-war debates over the merits and drawbacks of DST. In Nazi-occupied territories, the German authorities imposed Central European time, extending Berlin's time zone to conquered regions. This imposition of time zones functioned as a subtle tool of political control, standardizing clocks in the image of the ruling regime. In this context, time was not merely a convenience or a necessity, but a symbol of domination and conformity. Following the war, time zones became a point of diplomatic negotiation and national identity. As newly independent countries emerged from colonial rule, they often reconsidered their timekeeping systems as part of broader nation-building efforts. Some retained colonial time zones due to practicality, while others revised them to assert autonomy or cultural alignment. The symbolism of time became especially potent in regions seeking to redefine their place on the world stage. Meanwhile, scientific advancements in horology and time signal transmission continued apace. Atomic clocks, developed in the mid-20th century, provided unprecedented accuracy, allowing for more precise coordination of time across the globe. While their direct impact on civilian life was initially minimal, they laid the groundwork for later innovations like GPS and digital time synchronization. By the 1950s and 1960s, television had joined radio and aviation as another force driving the need for consistent timekeeping. Broadcasters needed standardized schedules to coordinate programming across regions. In the United States, the Federal Communications Commission played a role in regulating broadcast schedules and ensuring that television time zones matched civil time policies. Errors in time conversion or lack of clarity in programming led to widespread confusion, prompting stricter adherence to time zone labels like EST, CST, MST, and PST. As the world entered the space age, the question of time zones took on new dimensions. Astronauts aboard space missions experienced the relativity of time firsthand, often adhering to Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, while in orbit. The experience of time became more fluid, yet paradoxically more reliant on strict ground-based timing protocols. Even on the Moon, Apollo astronauts followed Earth-based mission clocks to ensure synchronization with mission control. These decades of refinement and negotiation of technological as the world stepped into the dawn of the 20th century, the conversation around time began to evolve with new urgency. Railroads, already influential in the development of standardized time, became even more vital as global trade networks expanded. Countries that had previously operated on multiple local times now felt the pressure to conform, streamline, and modernize their temporal infrastructure. In France, the debate over adopting Greenwich Mean Time had reached a fever pitch. Parisians, known for their deep attachment to cultural heritage, resisted the notion of relinquishing Paris Mean Time. Yet, with the advent of international communication and commerce, the practicality of aligning with GMT began to outweigh the sentimentality. Eventually, France adopted GMT with a 1-hour offset, a compromise that maintained national pride while embracing global uniformity. Across the Atlantic, the United States grappled with the complexities of time regulation. The Standard Time Act of 1918 marked a significant federal intervention, not only establishing standard time zones officially but also introducing daylight saving time as a wartime measure. The idea was to make better use of daylight hours, conserving energy during a period of national need. Though controversial, the concept took hold and would resurface in various forms throughout the century. Meanwhile, the world of science was also being reshaped by time. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, published in the early 1900s, revolutionized the understanding of time and space. No longer a fixed and absolute entity, time became relative, dependent on the observer's frame of reference. While this had little immediate impact on daily timekeeping, it altered the philosophical foundation upon which centuries of temporal certainty had been built. Technological innovations further transformed the way time was measured and perceived. The invention of the quartz clock in the 1920s brought an unprecedented level of accuracy. Unlike mechanical clocks, quartz timepieces relied on the consistent vibrations of quartz crystals when electrified. These clocks became the standard in laboratories and broadcasting, setting a new bar for precision. Broadcasting, particularly the rise of radio, played an unexpected role in reinforcing standardized time. As radio signals reached across towns and countries, it became crucial to synchronize programming. Time signals, broadcast by national observatories, helped listeners set their clocks with new accuracy, further embedding standard time into daily routines. In aviation, which was beginning to blossom, time coordination was essential. Early pilots navigated vast distances using primitive instruments and rudimentary maps. Coordinated time was necessary not just for departure and arrival schedules, but for navigation itself. Radio time signals provided crucial updates, guiding pilots across continents and oceans. The League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, took up the cause of international time coordination during its brief tenure. Proposals were made to further standardize time zones and eliminate half-hour or 45-minute offsets that complicated international scheduling. While these efforts met with mixed success, they underscored the growing awareness that time was no longer just a local concern, it was a global necessity. In everyday life, people began to feel the effects of this global shift. Factory workers in industrial cities set their lives by factory whistles and time clocks. Children arrived at school by the bell. Public transportation ran according to tightly coordinated schedules. The once personal rhythm of time had become a shared societal beat, driven by efficiency and order. Yet, despite all the efforts to impose uniformity, local customs persisted. In India, for example, the British colonial administration introduced Indian Standard Time, but many regions continued to use local times unofficially. In Newfoundland, a unique half-hour time zone reflected both geographic practicality and a stubborn regional identity. These anomalies reminded the world that time, while measured in universal units, was still experienced through a local lens. As the mid-century approached, the need for even more accurate timekeeping led to the development of atomic clocks. Based on the vibrations of atoms, specifically cesium atoms, these clocks could measure time with astonishing precision. The first practical atomic clock was built in 1955, and it soon redefined the second itself, which had previously been based on astronomical observations. This breakthrough set the stage for global positioning systems and the satellite age, where the synchronization of time across devices in motion, planes, ships, satellites, became mission-critical. The story of time had moved from the village clock tower to the reaches of space, yet the quest remained the same, to understand. As the 20th century progressed, the march of technological innovation brought new challenges and nuances to the global understanding of time. It was not merely the railways or telegraphs that demanded synchronization now, it was the airplane, the radio, and eventually, the television set. These instruments of connection and broadcast shrunk the world further, intensifying the need for coordinated timekeeping and giving rise to both ingenious solutions and quiet debates in dusty committee rooms. Aviation, in particular, became a major force in rethinking time zones. As commercial air travel surged in the post-World War I era and truly boomed after World War II, airlines found themselves navigating not just geographical distances but temporal disjunctions. Crossing multiple time zones in the span of a few hours created confusion for passengers and crew alike. Arriving before one departed, at least on paper, became a common peculiarity on transcontinental and transatlantic flights. Flight schedules, ticketing systems, and international agreements needed to accommodate a uniform temporal logic to ensure safety, efficiency, and clarity. To that end, the aviation industry began to rely heavily on Coordinated Universal Time, (UTC), a time standard that would eventually replace Greenwich Mean Time, (GMT), in many global operations. Unlike GMT, which was based on Earth's rotation and prone to slight irregularities, UTC was derived from atomic timekeeping, providing unmatched accuracy. By 1960, UTC was being adopted in sectors where precise synchronization mattered most. It offered a dependable backbone upon which schedules, navigation, and communication could be anchored, even if local clocks continued to tick to their own political rhythms. While airlines adopted UTC internally, travelers still experienced local times at departure and arrival points. To manage this, airport timetables included time zone information, and travel agents carried detailed charts to help passengers make sense of shifting hours. The interplay of global uniformity and local variation remained, and in that tension, a kind of order emerged, flexible, yet structured. Meanwhile, the rise of mass media brought its own timekeeping dilemmas. Radio broadcasts, initially local affairs, grew international and international phenomena. Scheduling programs across multiple time zones became a logistical puzzle. Broadcasters developed a broadcast timer maps, guiding listeners and viewers on when to tune in, adjusting for regional offsets. Major events, Presidential speeches, moon landings, or royal weddings had to be timed for maximum impact across different parts of the globe. This required not just careful planning but a deep cultural understanding of global audiences. Television, with its visual immediacy, heightened this challenge. A show airing at 8 p.m. Eastern Time might reach viewers on the West Coast at 5 p.m. if shown live, or be delayed to 8 p.m. local time. Networks made editorial decisions about whether to broadcast events live nationwide or tailor them to each time zone. These choices shaped collective experience, with entire regions watching together or apart, subtly influencing the cultural fabric of nations. Beyond entertainment, time zones began influencing politics. In some countries, central governments use time as a tool of integration or control. The Soviet Union, for example, eventually consolidated time zones across its vast territory, aligning them not necessarily with solar time but with administrative convenience. This practice of Moscow time created an artificial temporal unity, reinforcing central authority while causing local discrepancies between clock time and sun time. In China, a similar decision was made. Despite spanning 5 geographical time zones, the country operates on a single time, Beijing time. This has practical benefits, simplified administration and coordination, but also symbolic implications. It asserts a sense of unity across diverse regions, though in the far west, it leads to school children walking to class in darkness during winter mornings. These examples illustrate how timekeeping is never just technical, it is inherently political and cultural. The decision to align or resist a standardized time reflects identities, priorities, and power dynamics. For communities at the periphery, it can feel like time is imposed from afar, abstract and unyielding to local realities. Technological standardization continued apace. The spread of personal computers in the 1980s introduced digital timekeeping to everyday life. Unlike mechanical clocks, which could be set and forgotten, digital devices needed precise instructions. Software developers grappled with daylight saving time, leap seconds, and the quirks of local legislation. The infamous Y2K scare at the turn of the millennium underscored how deeply embedded and fragile these systems had become. A mere formatting issue, 2-digit year fields, threatened global operations, all because time, once again, was proving itself more complicated than it seemed. Mobile phones and the Internet would further accelerate the integration of time zones into our daily routines. Smartphones auto-adjusted based on GPS location, quietly aligning us with whatever time zone we entered. Cloud computing demanded coordinated timestamps to ensure consistency across servers in different hemispheres. Social media platforms, email systems, and collaborative tools required time zone awareness to function seamlessly. This constant recalibration made time zones both more invisible and more consequential. Users no longer needed to think about them, software handled the complexity. Yet behind the interface, engineers worked tirelessly to maintain databases of local time rules, updated regularly to account for government changes, daylight saving shifts, and rare anomalies. A single missed update could result in missed meetings, disrupted travel, or software errors. In a way, this digital abstraction of time echoed earlier transitions, from solar to mechanical, from mechanical to standardized, and now from standardized to algorithmic. Each step made time more precise and less human, more useful yet more removed from natural rhythms. And still, the debates continued. countries revised their time zone policies for economic reasons, aligning with trade partners or distancing from former colonial time schemes. Regions pushed for independence not just politically but temporally, proposing new time zones to assert identity or improve economic coordination. Daylight saving time, originally adopted to conserve energy during war, became a recurring controversy, with citizens arguing over its benefits and drawbacks. As Part 6 of this tale closes, the tapestry of time zones had grown rich and complex. It was no longer just a grid of lines across a map but a dynamic, living system shaped by commerce, politics, technology, and culture. The world had learned, as global commerce surged forward in the 20th century, the implications of standardized timekeeping touched every corner of modern society. With each passing decade, time zones became more than just a framework for synchronizing clocks. They became a cornerstone of how nations operated, how economies functioned, and how individuals structured their daily lives. In the wake of the two world wars, the globe found itself reeling from both destruction and innovation. Wartime had prompted vast improvements in technology, infrastructure, and communication. These advances created new expectations around coordination and speed, and time zones needed to keep pace. Governments around the world began to reassess and, in some cases, redraw their time zone boundaries to align better with political, economic, and logistical interests. One particularly significant shift occurred during the Cold War. The ideological divide between East and West extended into timekeeping itself. The Soviet Union, for example, implemented time zones that centralized power and control, often ignoring solar time in favor of more politically motivated decisions. Meanwhile, Western nations aligned time more closely with international standards and economic zones, reflecting a different set of priorities. This bifurcation of time philosophy mirrored the global tension of the era. Air travel, which had been revolutionized by military aviation, entered the commercial realm. With the founding of international airlines and the rapid construction of airports, people could now cross multiple time zones in mere hours. The psychological phenomenon known as jet lag became part of everyday vocabulary. Governments and international organizations worked quickly to develop scheduling standards, and time zones were key to that process. The rise of multinational corporations further complicated the landscape. These businesses operated across continents, with employees collaborating in real time from different parts of the world. Coordination required a shared understanding of time, down to the minute. This was the age when the concept of the business day began to stretch, leading to the development of global time management strategies. The 9-to-5 schedule slowly evolved into a 24-hour work culture for some industries. In tandem with these changes came the proliferation of media, radio, television, and eventually satellite communication. Broadcasting schedules had to account for time zones to ensure coherent programming across regions. Viewers in one country might tune in for a live event being broadcast from another, creating the need for accurate and publicly understood time zone conversions. News cycles, entertainment broadcasts, and sports events all leaned heavily on synchronized timekeeping. As more countries modernized, debates over daylight saving time, DST, grew louder. Proponents argued that shifting the clock conserved energy and better aligned waking hours with daylight. Critics pointed out the disruption it caused, especially to those with strict routines or sensitive biological clocks. The back and forth led to a patchwork of policies. Some regions embraced DST fully, others rejected it outright, and a few switched policies multiple times over a few decades. During this period, timekeeping also became a matter of national identity. For example, India, upon gaining independence, established Indian Standard Time to unify the nation's vast geography under a single time zone. Despite stretching across multiple solar hours longitudinally, the symbolic value of one national time outweighed the geographical inconvenience. Similarly, China adopted a single time zone, Beijing time, for the entire country, reinforcing central authority even at the cost of local solar accuracy. Africa presented a different story. With many of its nations emerging from colonial rule during the mid-20th century, time zones were often redrawn as part of nation-building efforts. These changes were not merely administrative but also political statements. Countries sought to distance themselves from former colonial powers by rejecting imposed timekeeping practices and asserting their own standards. Elsewhere, economic blocs began to emerge, most notably the European Economic Community, which evolved into the European Union. These regions saw value in harmonizing their time zones for ease of trade, travel, and administration. Time became a tool of unity, a shared metric across borders that facilitated integration and cooperation. Meanwhile, scientific advancements continued to push the boundaries of what timekeeping could achieve. Atomic clocks, which had already revolutionized precision, were now being deployed in more public and institutional settings. Observatories, research labs, and government facilities began to rely on these devices for experiments and measurements that required incredible accuracy. The definition of a second itself was re-established, not by Earth's rotation, but by the vibration of cesium atoms. These technological marvels found practical applications too. With the advent of satellite systems, particularly the American Global Positioning System, GPS, atomic clocks were embedded into satellites orbiting Earth. The precise synchronization of time between satellites and receivers allowed for exact geolocation. This was a pivotal moment in timekeeping history, as time no longer served only as a passive background to events but as a critical input for real-world navigation. Education also adapted. Time zones became a standard topic in geography curricula worldwide. Children learned how the Earth's rotation and the division into 24 longitudinal zones created the system. They learned to read maps showing time offsets and to calculate time differences between cities. While it might have seemed a dry subject at times, it was foundational to understanding how modern life functioned. The late 20th century also introduced cultural interpretations of time. Scholars and sociologists began to study how different societies perceived and valued time. In some cultures, punctuality became a virtue, in others, a more fluid sense of time prevailed. These differing perspectives occasionally clashed in international dealings, prompting calls for greater cultural awareness in global communication. In homes, the ticking of wall clocks, the chime of hourly bells, and the beep of digital alarms became constant reminders of time's structure. People scheduled their lives around it: meals, work, school, rest. The invention of the quartz watch in the 1960s made accurate personal timekeeping affordable and widespread. Time was now not just centralized in towers or government buildings but present on every wrist, in every household, silently guiding behavior. The media played a role too, often dramatizing the passage of time or the urgency it implied. Movies, television shows, and literature used time as a narrative device, racing against it, bending it, defying it. These themes reflected society's growing awareness and sometimes anxiety about the ticking clock. As the century drew to a close, globalization reached new heights. The Internet connected the world in ways previously unimaginable. Instant communication made time differences ever more relevant. Scheduling tools began to incorporate time zone converters, and digital calendars automatically adjusted for regional settings. Timekeeping had moved from static to dynamic, from mechanical to digital. And yet, despite all this progress, the fundamental challenge remained the same: how to live together on a spinning globe where the sun shines on different lands at different moments. Time zones, in all their... As the 20th century approached its midpoint, the foundation of time zones was well established, yet the system continued to evolve quietly in the background of global events. With wars, economic upheavals, and the growth of communication networks, timekeeping found itself both challenged and refined, often invisibly so. In the 1950s, the world was in the throes of post-war reconstruction. Cities rebuilt, industries roared back to life, and new technologies, radar, transistors, and eventually satellites, were seeding a revolution in how humans interacted with the world. And through it all, clocks ticked steadily, coordinating this global dance. One of the most significant influences on timekeeping during this period was the rise of commercial aviation. No longer limited to the military or elite, air travel became increasingly accessible. As airplanes soared across continents in a matter of hours, the dissonance of arriving before one had left, at least on the clock, was an experience shared by more and more people. This peculiarity of travel brought time zones into personal focus. Airlines adopted the use of Coordinated Universal Time (UTC) for all scheduling and communication to eliminate confusion across varying local times. Meanwhile, the Cold War's demand for precise and secure communications led to the refinement of time signals. Atomic clocks, initially developed for scientific purposes, became vital assets in military and global navigation systems. The cesium atomic clock, first operational in 1955, revolutionized timekeeping with unprecedented accuracy. Its tick, derived from the vibration of cesium atoms, became the new benchmark for the second, supplanting Earth's rotation, which had proven to be subtly irregular. Time zones, however, continued to face challenges from within. Political decisions influenced local times more than astronomical realities. In India, for example, the decision to implement a single time zone across a vast geography was a move toward national unity, even though the eastern states experienced sunrise well before their western counterparts. Similarly, China adopted a single time zone, Beijing time, despite spanning 5 geographical time zones. These decisions reflected political centralization, often at the cost of regional synchronicity with natural daylight cycles. In Europe, daylight saving time was introduced in more countries, sometimes provoking debate and confusion. The rationale of conserving energy had to be balanced against the social inconvenience of changing clocks twice a year. The shift was managed differently in each country, which occasionally led to scheduling mishaps and logistical issues, especially for trains and international broadcasts. Television, which emerged as a dominant force in global culture during this time, further highlighted the importance of synchronized time. Broadcast networks operated across multiple time zones, requiring careful planning and coordination to ensure programs aired consistently. Time zones, once a matter for train conductors and mariners, now touched the daily routines of ordinary citizens through their living room screens. By the 1960s, international cooperation on timekeeping intensified. Scientific communities and national observatories collaborated through organizations like the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, BIPM, to standardize timekeeping practices. The introduction of International Atomic Time, TAI, and later UTC provided a universal framework that balanced atomic precision with the human need for a consistent civil time. Still, the balance between nature and technology was delicate. Leap seconds, small adjustments added occasionally to UTC, were introduced in 1972 to account for irregularities in Earth's rotation. These additions kept atomic time in step with solar time, a reminder that even the most precise systems needed to accommodate the organic irregularities of the natural world. As global telecommunications expanded, from undersea cables to satellite networks, precise timekeeping became essential. Data transfer, financial transactions, and even simple phone calls across borders required accurate synchronization. A second too soon or too late could cause errors, miscommunication, or financial discrepancies. Culturally, the perception of time began to shift as well. In many parts of the world, people began to think in terms of global time, especially those working in international finance, logistics, and diplomacy. What time is it in New York, or when is the London market opening, became commonplace questions in offices far from either city. Time zones, while rooted in physical geography, had become the scaffold upon which global operations were built. Yet despite the increasing complexity, the underlying principle of time zones remained remarkably elegant. It was a system born not from necessity alone but from a desire for harmony, a way to make sense of the sun's journey across the sky in a world where humans moved faster and communicated farther than ever before. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, and then to the digital age, the foundations laid in the 19th century endured. Time zones had transcended their original purpose. No longer merely a solution for train timetables, they had become essential to the functioning of a connected, accelerating world. The changes were subtle, often unnoticed, but always present. In city halls and university labs, in airline offices and server rooms, people quietly calibrated, adjusted, and synchronized. Behind every flight that landed on time, every international call that reached its recipient, every broadcast that began with precision, the invisible scaffolding of time zones held firm. It was a legacy built not only by scientists and engineers, but also by communities, cultures, and countries choosing, year after year, to honor a shared rhythm. The final stretch of the journey through the history of time zones invites reflection on just how profoundly the march of time has structured and unified human civilization. As the 20th century matured into its later decades, and the 21st century dawned with unprecedented global connectivity, time zones had become not just tools of coordination, but quiet architects of our daily rhythms. In the age of the Internet, time zones found themselves both preserved and challenged. Digital clocks adjusted automatically across devices, and online calendars seamlessly translated events between regions. The boundaries of local time persisted, yet the concept of being in a specific zone began to blur with virtual presence. People scheduled meetings across continents, attended online lectures hosted half a world away, and even worked across multiple time zones as part of global teams. Time, while still rooted in the physics of Earth's rotation, became increasingly managed by software. One of the most fascinating evolutions was how international organizations began revisiting the structure of timekeeping to serve digital societies. proposals for reducing the number of time zones resurfaced, as did ideas for adopting a global reference time, often based on UTC, as a secondary or even primary time system in some digital-first environments. Coordinating global markets, airline systems, and cybersecurity protocols often favored the simplicity of a shared reference, even as local times remained important for cultural and social purposes. Meanwhile, debates continued over the observance of daylight saving time. Studies on its impact on human health, energy use, and even economic productivity influenced legislation around the world. Some countries abolished the practice entirely, citing its obsolescence in modern life. Others modified it to better suit their climates and lifestyles. The ebb and flow of these decisions underscored how time, though seemingly objective, remained a matter of human interpretation and preference. The story of time zones also became a part of popular culture. They featured in plots of international thrillers, were explored in documentaries about globalization, and became metaphors in literature for emotional distance and disconnection. Characters in novels crossed time zones not just geographically, but psychologically, as time became both a setting and a theme. In education, time zones became a topic that reflected broader discussions about colonialism, international cooperation, and technological change. Teachers used time zones to explain longitude and Earth rotation, but also to raise questions about why certain decisions were made and whose interests they served. The history of time zones became a lens through which students could examine the relationships between science, society, and power. As the world continues to evolve, one can imagine new challenges and innovations. Space travel, for example, has already brought forward questions of timekeeping beyond Earth. On the International Space Station, coordinated universal time is used to maintain order among astronauts from various countries. Future missions to the Moon or Mars will require new standards, and some scientists have begun imagining what time zones might look like on other planets, zones not based on terrestrial geography, but on the unique rotations and revolutions of those celestial bodies. Perhaps, in centuries to come, the concept of time zones will expand far beyond Earth. But for now, they remain a quiet testament to our attempt to order the chaos of the cosmos into something human, something relatable. The ticking of the clock, the setting of a watch, the automatic update of a smartphone at midnight, all these small signals are part of a vast tapestry woven over generations. From the earliest sundials casting shadows on dusty stone, to satellites adjusting global atomic clocks to the microsecond, humanity's desire to measure time and live by its rhythm has never waned. The time zones we rely on today are not merely divisions on a map, they are the result of centuries of observation, negotiation, and adaptation. They whisper stories of empire and resistance, of commerce and connection, of science and imagination. And as you listen to these closing thoughts, perhaps in the quiet moments before sleep, consider how even now, this very second, millions across the globe are experiencing different moments of the day. Somewhere, a child awakens to morning sunlight. Elsewhere, a traveler checks their watch as night falls. And in this beautiful orchestration of planetary time, each zone holds its own story, its own silence, its own breath in the great clockwork of Earth. Thank you for drifting through history with us. If this story helped you rest, we invite you to return whenever your mind seeks peace and wonder. Subscribe to Bed of Legends for more tales told softly, stories designed to lull you into slumber. Until next time, may your nights be calm and your dreams be timeless.